This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
My name is Michael McGregor and I'm the Robert Woolf Director of the Wordsworth Trust. I'd like to welcome you all very warmly to this, the 6th annual Wordsworth Lecture in partnership with the Institute of English Studies at the University of London. I want to start by saying how much we value our partnership with the Institute and the opportunity it affords us to further the cause of romantic scholarship and raise the profile of the Wordsworth Trust in the capital. Being out in the rural fastnesses of Grasmere, in the heart of the Lake District, you can sometimes feel a very long way from everything. And so opportunities to come down to London and wave the flag of Wordsworth are gratefully received. But this lecture is also very important to us because I know that we have a lot of very good friends, patrons, fellows who live down in London in the southeast and who support our work from afar. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening and delighted to have the opportunity to say a very heartfelt thank you from the trustees and the staff of the Wordsworth Trust for the support that you do give to us. I know it's not the same as coming up to Grasmere and seeing what's happening in person, but I hope that you feel through the communications that we send to you and events like this that you get some flavour of an organisation that is forward-thinking and moving in the right direction. For those of you, there may be one or two, who aren't familiar with the work of the Wordsworth Trust, there is information for you outside. There are a number of representatives of the Trust here this evening, who I'm sure you'll bump into afterwards, and they'll be delighted to tell you more about the work that we do. And that gives me the very greatest pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Fiona Stafford. Fiona is a Fellow and Professor in English Language and Literature at Somerville College, Oxford University. Her specialist interests include Romantic period literature, Scottish poetry, the relationship between English, Irish and Scottish literature, the literature of place and natural history writing. Her recent publications include a new edition of Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads as editor and an editor along with David Sargent of Burns and Other Poets. You may also be aware that Fiona did a splendid series on BBC Radio 3's essay slot called The Meaning of Trees, which leads very neatly into the subject of this evening's Wordsworth lecture, which is Wordsworth and the Meaning of Trees. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fiona Stafford.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everybody for coming this evening. Anyone who knows Wordsworth only from his most famous poem might be forgiven for thinking that he wasn't very interested in trees at all. I hardly need to quote it, but I will. It's on your handout. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high, or vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of dancing daffodils, along the lake beneath the trees, 10,000 dancing in the breeze. Well, the trees here are hardly centre stage. They're more of a backing group for the dancing daffodils. We might even wonder whether they only found their way into the poem at all for acoustic reasons. The breeze, obviously, has an important role. It makes the daffodils dance. So perhaps the trees are there just because they rhyme with breeze. It's one of Wordsworth's favourite rhyming pairs. He uses it into a butterfly and in the green linnet. As the breeze animates trees, it almost makes them onomatopoeic. But in another very well-known poem, the Intimations Ode, we find not trees, but a tree. As Wordsworth celebrates the sweet May morning, rejoicing in the sounds of spring, the poem's tone suddenly shifts, but there's a tree of many, one, a single field that I've looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat, whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? Once again, the flower is identified, but the tree isn't. And we're left unsure whether this is a particular tree that Wordsworth had observed, or a species of tree, or a metaphorical tree. As often with Wordsworth's simplest words, the line is enigmatic. And in the magnificent flow of the verse, it doesn't seem to matter too much The tree's role is to speak of something that is gone, the visionary gleam, the glory that fades. We're not in a real landscape here, so to start puzzling over which tree Wordsworth might have in mind seems to be rather missing the point. Indeed, the very urge to identify the kind of tree seems part of that adult consciousness that Wordsworth presents as part of the prison house shades closing in on the growing boy, darkening the bright, intuitive, imaginative apprehension of things. The more we attempt identification, the more difficult it is to see what the tree really means. Perhaps, I'm going to return to this later, for there are times when Wordsworth is very specific about naming trees. So I want to think a little bit more about this, and by placing the spotlight on Wordsworth's trees, I hope to shed some further light on his entire creative endeavour. We've already seen that Wordsworth's trees contribute various things: attractive backgrounds, convenient rhyme words, striking images, personal memories, enigmatic metaphors. But I actually want to look at trees as trees. Traditionally, they were very important features. They gave names to numerous places. In the Lake District, we can immediately think of Yew-Tree Farm, or Burke's Bridge, or Applethwaite, or Derwent, which means abounding in oaks, the same Celtic root as gives us Derry. Throughout Britain and Ireland, trees were obvious landmarks, easily recognised and essential to the local lexicon, part of the very grammar of the place. Trees had special functions beyond the obvious provision of timber and firewood or fruit. They marked boundaries, meeting places, and sacred sites. Trees marked the stations for prayers during the beating of the bounds. They were sometimes used for delivering sermons, especially for nonconformist preachers like Wesley or George Fox. And trees loom large in folk belief as wishing trees, healing trees, protective trees. We might think of the basin of boxwood by the coffin in Wordsworth's childless father. Sometimes there were memorials, as in the hartshorn tree near Penrith, site of the legendary stag hunt that features in Wordsworth's sonnet. And near Rydal there's the Lord's Oak, which marked the spot where people met to discuss parish issues. There were trees where people gathered to undertake seasonal tasks. The clipping tree in Wordsworth's Michael is a good example, so called because it protected the sheep shearers from the hot sun. Oak trees have huge canopies and very thick clusters of leaves, and hence that enormous breadth of shade. And then there's the large elm in the excursion, the joyful tree that's used for May dances. Trees were just part of the community, familiar to all and almost familial. During Wordsworth's lifetime, some trees began to attract special attention, either because of their extreme age or size. Thomas Pennant, when he went up to Scotland, wrote about the Fortingall yew in Perthshire and measured it. It was 56 feet in circumference. Artists were beginning to draw portraits of trees. Paul Sandby, Francis Town, John Constable, we especially think of drawing his ash trees. And with the publication of William Gilpin's Forest Scenery, trees became established not just as attractive backgrounds for picturesque views, but as characters in their own right. Gilpin lived in the New Forest for many years, and he was struck by the individuality of trees, their new unique shapes, and a whole section of his book is devoted to notable trees. And this inspired further books such as Jacob Strutt's Silva Britannica, which had lovely engravings of famous trees that had now become status symbols for landowners. There's a couple of his engravings from his book on the front of the handout. The Duke of Portland had a road cut through the great Greendale oak at Welbeck to form a triumphal arch. And the Duke of Athol's larch trees were famous throughout the land. When William and Dorothy visited on their Scottish tour of 1803, they were dragged from place to place by the gardener, according to Dorothy, and shown the first larches of Scotland, which had been grown from the sapling that his Grace had brought up in his carriage. Now, these trees had very different cultural significance from those old, practical, communal associations that had grown up over centuries. They reflect the new assumptions about land ownership, which were being consolidated by landscape parks. This was the great era of landscape gardening, and for many, the Gentleman's Park was a symbol of nationhood, of order and continuity. especially after the publication of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Alarmed by the revolution, Burke offered an ideal of gradual national progress rooted in the old system of inherited property and power. So planting for posterity was a metaphor for responsible estate management and responsible government of the state. And since the national economy and defence also depended on oak-built ships, planting trees was a patriotic duty, especially at times of war. However, as the Duke of Athol's Arch demonstrates, improving the estate often meant importing trees that other landowners didn't have. And the Wordsworths were very conscious of this. On their visit to Athol, they not only paused at the Duke's Arch, but they visited the falls of Brewer for the sake of Burns. And his poem, The Humble Petition of Brewer Water to the noble Duke of Athol, ventriloquised the pretty but rather exposed waterfall. This is on your handout. Burns imagines her embarrassment under the admiring gaze of the poet. To cover her modesty and enhance her beauty, the waterfall requests some tree planting. And this is one of the earliest defences of trees in the era of landscape gardening. Burns avoided explicit protest, but he sent his whimsical poem to the Duke, who apparently took note, because when the Wordsworths visited again 15 years later, Dorothy noted that the riverbanks had been planted with mixed firs and larches. And she said that for Burns' sake we wish that they had been the natural trees of Scotland, birches, ashes, mountain ashes. But she was still ready to concede that 60 or 70 years hence there'll be no unworthy monument to his memory. And I think you can see in the picture, which hasn't come out terribly well, that by 1850 the waterfall was actually very modestly clad. So this is a rare example of poetry actually influencing practical policy. William Cooper also lamented the loss of his favourite poplars and deplored the destruction of entire avenues, yew-fallen avenues, once more unmourned by fate unmerited. But Wordsworth was even more forthright in a sonnet written after seeing the bare hillside at Needpath, stripped of its native woods by the Duke of Queensberry. This is on handout. Degenerate Douglas, thou unworthy lord, who mere despite of heart could so far please, and love of havoc, for with such disease found fame taxing, that he could send forth word to level with the dust a noble horde, a brotherhood of venerable trees, leaving an ancient dome and towers like these, beggared and outraged. Many hearts deplore the fate of those old trees. Its strong language harks back to traditional ballads about the warlike Douglas family, only to emphasise the degeneration of the current heir. And you get a more muted version of this in a letter Wordsworth wrote to George Beaumont about gardening, where the thought of Annick, modern Annick, makes him think of the ancient Perses, but only in contrast. How could the modern Douglas feel any sense of triumph in levelling an unarmed brotherhood of venerable trees? The adjective venerable almost suggests a parallel with the Viking raids on Lindisfarne and Yarrow. And yet, the sonnet also offers a very Wordsworthian reflection, because it seems both to present and question the traveller's view by pointing to those sheltered places, pure mountains, and silent pastures that still remain. It's a kind of balancing perspective, not unlike the closing lines of The Ruined Cottage, where the old pedlar gently admonishes the young traveller, advising him not to read the forms of things with an unworthy eye. The Douglas sonnet is at once deploring the havoc wrought by careless, unfeeling landowners, and at the same time reminding us of the larger picture, in which the eternal power of nature utterly dwarfs that of even the most powerful, destructive man. Wordsworth's faith in nature didn't allay his anxieties about landscape gardening, though. His Guide to the Lakes, as you'll all know, has a lot to say on the recent disfigurement of the Lake District. There, Wordsworth describes how the venerable wood that had grown for centuries around the small house called St Herbert's Hermitage, including oaks planted by the hermit's own hand, had now been felled and replaced by Scotch firs. On Vicar's Island, too, the embowering sycamores and cattle shed were removed to make way for a neoclassical tower guarded by a platoon of firs. Worse still were the huge plantations of larch, suddenly popular for their novelty value and status, thanks to the Duke of Athol. Their quick growth ensured quick return on investment, but as far as Wordsworth is concerned, these enormous alien intrusions were just disfiguring the steady growth of the local landscape. He says if 10,000 of this spiky tree are stuck in at once upon the side of a hill, that they can grow up into nothing but deformity. But if the great landowners seem to be annexing the meaning of trees in this period, trees continued to be very much part of the mindscape of the less powerful. We only have to think of Tolpuddle, the small Dorsetshire village, which would become famous as the birthplace of the trade union movement, where the 6 labourers met under the great sycamore on the village green in 1834. And given the sycamore's lowly status, the common sycamore, the Tolpuddle tree quickly became a symbol for the dignity of the common man, and you can actually still go and visit it, lots of people do. So although some associated great trees with great inherited power, others took them as symbols of political reform, and especially after Thomas Paine concluded the best-selling Rights of Man with an elaborate extended metaphor conveying the new enlightened age as a kind of spring budding with political change. If a single bud on that twig had begun to swell, then it meant that the same appearance was beginning or about to begin everywhere. In answer to Burke's vision of the natural order, Paine was sowing the seeds of the liberty tree and welcoming the arrival of spring. So the meaning of trees in Wordsworth's day was not only deeply rooted, but also variegated and capable of rapid new growth. In lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, we can see a range of contemporary tree meanings, as Wordsworth revisits the Sylvan, wood-surrounded Wye, famous for its picturesque beauties since Gilpin's tour. Wordsworth emphasises the more functional aspects of the landscape too, the farms, the orchards, the wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from the trees, which refers to the charcoal burners who were busy turning logs into charcoal for the iron foundry at Tintern. But the poet sights himself here under this dark sycamore, it's a long 10. And at once the general landscape comes into sharper focus. It's perhaps no accident that in a poem revisiting the moment when Wordsworth's radical commitment was felt most intensely, he should foreground a common sycamore. The poem is, of course, dated July 1798 and looks back very specifically to 1793, when Wordsworth passed through the Wye after witnessing the British fleet at Spithead and suffered the most intense internal conflict at the thought of England at war with his adopted country, France, where his new baby had recently been born. When he finally wrote about this inner turbulence in the prelude, he found expression for those unmanageable feelings of alienation through the language of trees, and I've just included this little passage from the prelude. I, who with the breeze had played, a green leaf on the blessed tree of my beloved country, nor had wished for happier fortune than to wither there, now from my happy station was cut off and tossed about in whirlwinds. So that favourite animating breeze is transformed by international conflict into a destructive whirlwind, ripping him away from the blessed native tree. In the much more peaceful frame of mind that gave rise to Tintern Abbey 5 years later, Wordsworth sat beneath a sycamore, no doubt because there happened to be one there. But in choosing to include this detail in his poem, he was choosing the poor man's tree, the provider of sweet sap to insects, birds, and cottage children, rather than the supplier of warships. But there were other reasons for his choice. Because the sycamore was the tree of the contemplative man, according to the complete angler, who sits under a dark sycamore to meditate. It also plays a vital role in the story of Zacchaeus, the outsider figure in the New Testament, cut off from those around him, who climbs into a sycamore to see Jesus. The sycamore was the means to the divine and to reintegration. And I'm not suggesting that Wordsworth is offering a religious allegory in Tintern Abbey, but I'm drawing attention to this unexpected dimension of the sycamore to show how Wordsworth's details so often suggest something more than initially meets the eye. Until fairly recently, knowledge of different trees was common enough. A century ago, lots of people would have just known the difference between an elm and an oak, horse chestnut, a hazel. a birch, a beech, a hornbeam, a white billy. I could go on. And I'm sure everybody still does, but being able to identify a tree isn't quite the same as growing up with the knowledge of how they're used, or indeed of the rich cultural meanings they possess. The connection between woodland smoke, charcoal burning, and surrounding trees is much less obvious to a modern urban audience than it would have been to Wordsworth's readers. But when we begin to uncover some of the older associations, it's surprising what emerges. It's a bit like the arrival of spring, a fresh meaning bursts from a familiar poem. Wordsworth was evidently very conscious of different kinds of tree. We know that John Evelyn's classic work, Silver, was one of the books at Hawkshead, and his poetry is full of specific trees. Think of the willow, where the stolen boat was moored, the birch trees on the rocky island at Rydal, the hazel grove in Nutting, Matthew with the wilding in his hand, the lime trees around Reynolds's memorial, or the beeches hiding Mary's nook from public view. These details deepen the power of the poetry by establishing an authenticity based on first-hand observation. And we see this in It Was an April Morning, again, it's on your handout. Because here, every naked ash and tardy tree is yet leafless, very precise description. But as the poet climbs, he comes to a waterfall surrounded by radiant colour. Green leaves were here, but 'twas the foliage of the rocks, the birch, the yew, the holly, the bright green thorn, with hanging islands of resplendent firs. These lines could only have been written by somebody who had looked hard at a real hillside in April and taken mental note. These are trees native to the northern hills. They are the foliage of the rocks, and all have come into leaf some weeks before the naked ash. Yew and holly and evergreen, of course, but it doesn't mean they're immune to seasonal changes. Even the yew can be drenched in gold pollen in the spring, and its glossy, fresh green needles fit perfectly with this heart-lifting explosion of greenery. Wordsworth, like Hardy, was a man who noticed things. In The Excursion on the Banks of Ullswater, which was based on Dorothy's journal for November 1805, we can feel a shared delight in the colour of individual trees on a frosty morning. As Dorothy's sentence is described almost verbatim into the published account, this is on the handout, we observed the lemon-coloured leaves of the birches as the breeze turned them towards the sun, sparkle, or rather flash like diamonds, and the leafless purple twigs were tipped with globes of shining crystal. Now, this is November, not the traditional month for admiring trees or breezes, but listen to the abundant recompense that Wordsworth finds. The trees in Galborough Park were in that state when what is gained by the disclosure of their bark and branches compensates, almost, for the loss of foliage, exhibiting the variety which characterises the point of time between autumn and winter. The hawthorns were leafless, their round heads covered with rich green berries, and adorned with arches of green brambles, and eglantines hung with glossy hips, and the grey trunks of some of the ancient oaks, which in the summertime might have been regarded only for their venerable majesty, now attracted notice by a pretty embellishment of green mosses and fern, intermixed with russet leaves, retained by those slender, outstarting twigs, which the veteran tree would not have tolerated in its strength. The smooth silver branches of the ashes were bare, most of the alders as green as Devonshire cottage myrtle that weathers the snows of Christmas. The harmonious mix of the Wordsworth's descriptive powers matches the variations of the natural scene, offering direct, spontaneous response to the natural world and reflection upon it. It's the kind of collaborative writing that Lucy Newlyn has written about so beautifully in her recent book. This ability to include precise details with the air of incontrovertible fact is a crucial element in Wordsworth's poetry too, where trees generally stand unapologetically as physical facts. Wordsworth's approach is very different from someone like Erasmus Darwin, the poet-scientist, who tended to mix kind of extravagant neoclassicism with horticulture in order to bring botany to a wider audience. For Wordsworth, a holly is a holly. And he refers to trees with the natural authority of someone who simply knows what kind it is and expects that his readers will too. It's not scientific writing, it's parochial. If you don't know what an ash or a birch looks like, you just take its existence on trust because of Wordsworth's tone. In The Ruined Cottage, The recurrent references to the clustering elms carry utter conviction and thereby strengthen the authenticity of Margaret's story. The lofty elms mark the pedlar's return to Margaret's cottage, and in the end they seem oddly immune to the fate of the garden below, where a young apple tree is dying through neglect. The lofty elms are part of nature's calm, oblivious tendencies, for in their very last appearance, they're home to songbirds and lit by the mellow radiance of the setting sun. When Wordsworth revised the poem to form the opening book of the excursion, which, as you know, is a very complicated process, very brilliantly explained by Stephen Gill, so I won't go into it in detail, the elms of the ruined cottage were still prominent, but Wordsworth had made a significant change. For where the ruined cottage was originally presented beneath the shade of clustering elms that sprang from the same root, in the excursion it is amid the gloom spread by a brotherhood of lofty elms. And this change links the trees to a feeling later expressed by the pedlar as he stands by the cottage and explains how the bond of brotherhood he had once felt with the entire place has been broken by the loss of Margaret. His choice also links these lines to the brotherhood of venerable trees felled by degenerate Douglas, that metaphor for natural unity that is and is not vulnerable to human loss and degradation. And actually, Wordsworth's choice is even more precise than we might realise, because the word brotherhood was also used by the botanist William Withering, and we know that Wordsworth had ordered withering botany in March 1801. So, as he revised the ruined cottage, we can see Wordsworth grafting words that have been nurtured in other frames onto rootstock that have been growing since 1797. His poems are strengthened by internal connections and new meanings, which are absorbed almost imperceptibly into their final organic whole. Wordsworth was also fascinated by traditional ways of understanding the world, the natural language of country law, and the psychological realities underlying what some dismissed as quaint or outdated. When Betty Foy equips her disabled child with a holly bough before sending him off alone through the woods at night, for example, she's trusting to the widespread folk belief in the protective properties of the plant, the association of holly with holiness. But in doing so, she's also revealing a means to control fear in a situation unguarded by modern lifelines. She had no phone, no emergency services. In Hartley Well, a site of ancient cruelty is marked by withered aspen trees. And this reflects the folk tradition that viewed aspens as the tree that furnished the wood for the cross. Aspen, or Populus tremulus, is a kind of poplar distinguished by its perpetually shaking leaves. Even on a really quiet day, those heart-shaped leaves are always trembling. They find a breeze that isn't there, really. So although tree stumps are an obvious enough symbol of death, Wordsworth's emphasis on the specific, on the aspen tree, makes what's really an ailing metaphor start pulsing with new possibility. 3 aspen stumps are a stark memorial to the panting deer, or hart, which is a traditional image of Christ. And that's a connection that's spelt out explicitly in Home at Grasmere, which he composed soon afterwards. Hartley Well is a poem for thinking hearts, and Wordsworth's trees very often prompt the continuing growth of his poems in the reader's mind. They stimulate thoughts that don't necessarily spring up immediately, but start working down into the mind, reaching unexpected layers. Like the dark sycamore, the 3 aspens offer natural revelations. Wordsworth, it seems, is charging the language, giving it power without explaining it. And this, I think, is part of his great endeavour to revitalise English poetry. And to see the difference between Wordsworth's understated use of trees and the more scientific contemporary approaches, we might look at Goody Blake and Harry Gill. This had its source in Erasmus Darwin's Zoonomia, kind of early work on psychosis. Darwin had included a news report on a Warwickshire farmer who waited on a cold night to apprehend the thief who was stealing his wood, only to be cursed by the elderly culprit with never being warm again and spending the rest of his life shivering. So this is a true story. But Wordsworth chooses a ballad style that means the exposure of the landlord's casual tyranny reads more like a folk tale, and the vulnerable tenant's sense of injustice becomes charged with supernatural suggestions. And of course, this enabled him to make social comments without too much danger of prosecution in a decade where so many were being arrested for seditious writings, though one early reviewer did think that this poem threatened real anarchy. But as Goody spins at her wheel, like any old woman in a fairy story, the detail about her long hours of hard labour being insufficient to pay for candlelight is much less visible as an attack on Pitt's candle tax. But once again, the poem features a specific tree. For as Goody collects firewood, Harry Gill is concealed behind an elder tree, and this stands on the handout. Right glad was he when he beheld her, stick after stick did Goody pull. He stood behind a bush of elder, till she had filled her apron full. Not only is the elder a common hedging tree, fast-growing and bushy, but its low twigs and older branches are very easy to break off. A starving old woman would have much more chance of pulling wood from an elder than almost any other kind of tree, certainly better than a hawthorn, which would have just shredded her hands. And it's this specificity that makes the whole poem come alive. It releases the power of the poem, I think. The elder tree also had mixed associations. It was a protection against witches, but also a tree under the power of wise women. And this probably arose from its physical appearance. Those of you who've looked at an old elder tree will have seen how twisted they can become, and they can appear to be withering away long before they actually die. But of course, there's an obvious pun as well, for elder underlines Goody's declining years and the lack of respect afforded to them. Harry does not regard this elder as his better. And it's easy enough to dismiss the supernatural dimension of the poem, but there are other kinds of truth, and that's why this poem interests me. The psychological effects on Harry Gill of being confronted with the consequences of his actions are plain enough, as his emotional coldness becomes a physical reality. But the poem also has the power to unsettle readers, not through fear of the supernatural, but through its unexpected revelations. Harry's unmerciful attitude was entirely lawful, according to legislation at the time that banned the poor from ancient common rights. But what were the consequences of securing one's property for those vulnerable people who'd relied on free fuel? They were urgent questions for the 1790s, and they're still questions for today. Goody Blake is in fuel poverty. She's in danger of hypothermia. So Wordsworth's version of the folktale is distilling perennial problems of provision for vulnerable members of society, and every individual's personal responsibility for those less able to look after themselves. But the elder may also stand for the language of the past, those elder writers who are praised in the advertisement to Lyrical Ballads. Because this poem is not dismissing older folk belief, but showing that there are different ways of addressing things, different languages, if only we use them. The trees in Wordsworth's poetry offer an ancient vocabulary, a means to articulate things often difficult to explain in literal terms. Their full meanings are often latent, as the words plant seeds in the readers' minds, which go on growing steadily, surprisingly. And this is what Coleridge saw at once when he first read Wordsworth's poetry. He remembers this in Biographia, in terms of gorgeous blossoms rising out of a hard, thorny rind and shell, within which the rich fruit was elaborating. Wordsworth's trees are often promises of something about to be. But in Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth is evoking elder poets in order to create a new kind of poetry. In The Oak and the Broom, for example, he challenges the conventional association of the oak with enduring strength and longevity, because the advice of Wordsworth's oak, half giant and half sage, and rather pumped up by centuries of human admiration, just makes the young broom begin to doze. It's only to keep herself awake that she gently interposes. So it wasn't that Wordsworth was being anti-oak in this poem, but he recognised that some natural phenomena had been so kind of hemmed in by centuries of literary invention that they couldn't really breathe. And I think as he sends the oak tree crashing down, he's freeing it for future writers by encouraging them to look at the world afresh. And I now want to turn to a poem about trees and dwell in a little more detail on it. These are trees that have that possess a special place in Wordsworth's psyche, I think. They recur throughout his work. And I'm referring, of course, to yew-trees, which are the back of the handout. And this is a poem that both Wordsworth and Coleridge regarded as a creation of the highest imagination. And it's sometimes a poem that not everybody reads. I'm sure everybody knows it very well, but it is a bit neglected, I think. 4 different versions survive in the manuscripts at Dove Cottage, and I was lucky enough to look at them this summer thanks to Jeff Cowton and the wonderful staff at the Jerwood Centre. I'm going to focus on the poem that Wordsworth published in Poems 1815, but the earlier version of 1811 is on your handout too. So I'll just read this out so everybody can think about yew-trees. There is a yew-tree, pride of Lorton Vale, which to this day stands single in the midst of its own darkness, as it stood of yore, not loath to furnish weapons for the bands of Umfraville or Percy ere they marched to Scotland's heaths, or those that crossed the sea and drew their sounding bows at Agincourt, perhaps at earlier Cressy or Poitiers. Of vast circumference and gloom profound, this solitary tree, a living thing produced too slowly ever to decay, a form and aspect too magnificent to be destroyed. But worthier still of note are those fraternal 4 of Borrowdale, joined in one solemn and capacious grove, huge trunks, and each particular trunk a growth of intertwisted fibres, serpentine, upcoiling, and inveterately convolved, nor uninformed with fantasy and looks that threaten the profane, a pillared shade, upon whose grassless floor of red-brown hue, by sheddings from the pining umbrage tinged perennially, beneath whose sable roof of boughs, as if for festal purpose, decked with unrejoicing berries, ghostly shapes may meet at noontide, fear and trembling hope, silence and foresight, death the skeleton and time the shadow, there to celebrate, as in a natural temple, scattered all with altars undisturbed of mossy stone, united worship, or in mute repose to lie and listen to the mountain flood murmuring from Glaramara's inmost caves. It's a poem rooted in place, or rather a pair of places, Lorton Vale and Borrowdale, both in the northern lakes on either side of the Honesler Pass. The trees are evidently known to the narrator, and they're to be seen by anyone who takes the trouble to find them. There is a yew-tree, pride of Lorton Vale, which to this day stands single. And you can still see these trees with a little effort, though one of the Borrowdale yews blew down in 1883, so it's not been quite as it did when Wordsworth was there. But if you visit Lorton, as I'm sure many of you have, you'll find the old yew behind Hope Bay, outlined against the distant hills, and now identified by a helpful laminate sign, which slightly diminishes the sense of achievement when you come across the tree, but it does at least mean you're in no doubt that you've got to the right one. When Thomas Pakenham searched for the tree in the mid-90s, he found it apparently unknown to any of the men of Lorton, a telling illustration of the way in which even the most enormous ancient trees seem to disappear from view for much of the 20th century. The Borrowdale yews remain better known and figure on OS maps. They also suffered in the 19th century, but were well enough known to feature in the Jubilee list of the 15 greatest trees. But when did Wordsworth see them? For in this poem, as ever, he's very clearly drawing on close personal observation. Wordsworth might have seen the Lorton tree when he was growing up in Cockermouth, only 4 miles away, given its local fame. But we know he saw it in 1804 because Dorothy wrote to Lady Beaumont about their trip from Keswick across the Winglatter Pass in October. And she said, "We dropped down soon after into the fertile vale of Lorton and went to visit a yew-tree, which is the patriarch of yew-trees, green and flourishing in very old age, the largest tree I ever saw. We have many large ones in this country, but I've never yet seen one that would not be as a branch to this." Now, whether the first passages of Yew-Trees began to form in Wordsworth's mind at this stage isn't recorded, but it seems quite likely. Jonathan Wordsworth and Tim Fulford have both suggested that Wordsworth's interest in ancient trees might have been whetted by Cooper's Yardley Oak, which had appeared for the first time in 1803. And there are certainly passages in Yew-Trees that seem to recall Cooper's poem. And Wordsworth's interest, as we've seen, had been stimulated by the Scottish tour the year before and by conversations with Scott. But Wordsworth had travelled through Borrowdale with his brother John a few years before, in November 1799 and again in September 1800, so they may have seen the Borrowdale yews on both occasions. Yew-Trees is part of Wordsworth's larger Lakeland project, which really began when he settled in Grasmere in 1799 after a decade of travelling. The opening line is not unlike that of Michael, with the narrator mediating between the Lake District and the reader. The voice is also not unlike that of the Guide to the Lakes, published in 1810, the year before the earliest manuscript version of Yew-Trees. Worthier still of note, does sound rather like a guidebook, directing us to the most significant sites. So Yew-Trees not only draws energy from the local environment, but has the capacity to speak to people who know nothing of Lawton or Borrowdale. Pictures of the trees grow in the reader's mind because of the well-chosen words. As we read, or listen, we can see the dark outline of the vast Lawton yew, or the group of trees banding together in Borrowdale. The detailed observation of a grassless floor of red-brown hue, coloured by perennial sheddings from the pining umbrage, provides a very vivid description of the ground under a group of yews, whose thick evergreen branches prevent even a chink of light getting through, so the trunks remain oddly free of undergrowth, and the dark green needles falling from above turn gradually into a thick rusty carpet. Wordsworth's language is precise and yet poetic. We can hear the alliteration and assonance of the perennial sheddings from the pining umbrage. Pining is especially striking. It suggests a resemblance to pine needles, almost as if the yew is straining to become a pine tree, but it actually refers to the action of the umbrage, or the tree's shade. A slippery verb to pine originally meant to torment, but then it began to mean to suffer pain, giving rise to the more recognisable meaning of yearning, languishing with desire, pining for. But there's also a specific northern dialect meaning for the word, which is to lose vigour or dry out, and this is clearly the primary meaning here. The OED records its use in a Yorkshire agricultural report of 1800 to describe drying corn. It pined and lost bulb. So Wordsworth is using this word with technical accuracy, while at the same time suggesting a host of imaginative possibilities. The extraordinary image of the trunks, each a growth of intertwisted fibre serpentine, upcoiling and inveterately convolved, is also astonishingly accurate, because ancient yews are a mass of fibres and tubes. The reason for the tree's extraordinary longevity is its ability to regenerate. It sends down roots from the crown that gradually develop bark, and that makes them quite difficult to distinguish from the original bark, the original trunk. So with yews, it can be hard to tell whether a close-knit group is just part of one ancient tree, and this would make the fraternal four a true brotherhood, even more closely connected than the elms in the Ring Cottage, or whether it's a clump of younger trees seated in a single plot whose branches have become intertwined. Again, Wordsworth's language is essential to the full meaning. The syntax twists and turns. He even has to invent a word, upcoiling, to convey the action of these living phenomena. Again, it's almost technical writing with those intertwisted fibres, but the words are charged with literary meaning. Convolved means coiled or rolled together, but it has a further, now obsolete meaning of convulsed with pain, and that's the sense used by Cooper and by Milton in Paradise Lost. Satan first knew pain and writhed him to and fro convolved. And this may seem a bit of a long way from Borrowdale, but then we see the word serpentine. Consider the Latinate language and contorted syntax, and the shadow of Milton seems to be looming quite large in Rose's poem. The final line, murmuring to no Mara's inmost caves, is reminiscent of Satan's departure from Eden. murmuring, and with him fled the shades of night. But the most striking Miltonic allusion is pillared shade, which alludes directly to the description of the fig tree in Paradise Lost, branching so broad and long that in the ground the bended twigs take root and daughters grow about the mothered tree, a pillared shade, high overarched, and echoing walks between. Milton's marvellous arboreal passage was singled out by Coleridge and Biographia as a masterpiece of imaginative literature, and he distinguished it from the laborious kind of descriptive writing that makes us look first at one part and then another. Coleridge quotes Milton's lines on the fig tree in full, presents them as creation rather than painting, or if painting, yet such, and with such co-presence of the whole picture, flashed at once upon the eye. And Coleridge says that Milton understands the latency of all in each. And in the very same chapter of Biographia, when he analyses the strengths of Wordsworth's poetry, he chooses yew-trees to exemplify Wordsworth's gift of imagination in the highest and strictest sense of the word. Yew-Trees was the poem that demonstrated Coleridge that in imaginative power, Wordsworth stands nearest of all modern writers to Shakespeare and Milton, and yet in a kind perfectly unborrowed and his own. So though Wordsworth's writing is full of allusions, it's not remotely imitative. Yew-Trees carries resonances of Milton's great epic, which that pillared shade sets off. But the poem still remains entirely distinct and self-supporting. Its firm grounding in a real place, its focus on recognisable local trees, is as far from Milton's practice as could be. So the Miltonic echoes amplify, but never threaten to overwhelm Wordsworth's highly original voice or subject. And I now want to think a little bit more about the distinctiveness of Wordsworth's poem and the latency of all in each, because I think we can trace some of those hidden connections and link it to some of Wordsworth's other poems. Yew-Trees is very clearly fixed in place, but oddly elusive when it comes to time. 1804, 1811, 1814. But this is oddly appropriate because ancient yew-trees themselves are almost impossible to date because of these regenerating habits. Wordsworth's poem is exploring timelessness, or expanses of time beyond human comprehension. He knew that yew-trees lived for thousands of years and dwarfed human history. And yet the poem still draws attention to human history. We can see this from the difference between the published version and the 1811 draft. The idea of a tree standing as it stood of yore reinforces a sense of continuity. It's reassuring and much needed at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1811, before the retreat from Moscow, Napoleon still seemed unstoppable, so any symbol of steadfastness has strong appeal. But by 1814, the international situation was completely different, and hence perhaps the addition of those lines evoking the legendary English victories over the French, Agincourt, Crecy, Poitiers. And of course it's even more timely when the poem was published in 1815, the year of Waterloo. So the Yew's association with battles is twofold. Most obviously, those references to Agincourt underline its antiquity, the amazing fact that the tree Wordsworth's visiting is the very same tree that was growing in Lawton in the 13th century. But as yew-trees were also crucial to medieval military power, they were actually contributing to the victory in the form of longbows. The Lawton yew is a kind of early munitions factory, and though modern battles obviously relied on gunpowder and steel, some of the local pride in the Lawton yew derived from this ancient service. And there's nothing sentimental about this. When Wordsworth visited Lawton in 1804, fears of a French invasion were running very high, and he had a very different attitude to the conflict by this stage. So I think he may well have reflected on the yew's historic role as defender of the realm. But despite these stirring possibilities, Yew-Trees does not strike me as very triumphalist in mood. The Lawton yew stands single in the midst of its own darkness. It's vast, but also gloom profound. And the sable roof of the Borrowdale trees seems similarly sober. Pine and umbrage emphasises shade, and we've already noted those melancholy associations. What are these yews pining for? But I think most striking are those unrejoicing berries. As far as I know, this is the only time Wordsworth ever uses this word, and he chooses it for the blood-red fruits, which were often taken to represent the blood of Christ and everlasting life. The yew is the tree of graveyards, but there's no church in this poem. Instead, the trees form a natural temple, with looks that threaten the profane. It's a place of natural solemnity, but not of rejoicing. And for a poet whose responses to the natural world are so often celebratory and joyful, the gloom of yew-trees seems uncharacteristically unyielding. And of course the yew is of all trees the one most readily associated with death. Shakespeare calls it double fatal because of the longbows and because of the poisonous foliage. So we might think a little more about the odd juxtaposition of the solitary tree and the fraternal four, and why the latter are worthier of note. Wordsworth had seen the trees by 1804 at the latest, and he was, at that point, one of 4 brothers. By 1811, when he committed the first version of the poem to paper, only 3 were left. John, to whom he'd been closest, drowned in 1805 off the Dorset coast, leaving the family devastated. And in a poem written long before John's death, soon after the visit to Grasmere and the Borrowdale tour, Wordsworth had described his brother's special affinity with trees, and in particular the grove of fir trees near Dove Cottage, where John loved to walk. It's the poem now usually known as When First I Journeyed Hither, first published in the 1815 Poems under the title Went to the Attractions of the Busy World. After John left Dove Cottage and went back to sea, Wordsworth, as he says in the poem, and again this is on the handout, sit at evening when the steep of Silver Howe and Grasmere's silent lake and one green island gleam between the stems of the close firs. And there he thought of John, the silent poet, far away on the joyless ocean, but perhaps at that very moment pacing the deck and thinking of his fir grove. In Wordsworth's evocation of John's imagination, at every impulse of the moving breeze, the fir grove murmurs with a sea-like sound. Again, it's a variation of the trees and the breeze. And it's not difficult, poem might have fed into the later meditation on the murmuring, unrejoicing, fraternal yew-trees. John's grove acquired much deeper significance after John's death, though the poem written about it in 1800 remained unpublished for 15 years. But as Wordsworth prepared his poems for publication in 1815, he worked on both yew-trees and the poem about John's grove. In the manuscript of Dove Cottage, the transcription of yew-trees is on the same page as 3 different versions of the opening lines of When First I Journeyed Hither, showing just what a struggle Wordsworth had had with the poem about John's trees. It seems that the poems were linked in Wordsworth's mind, and that Yew-Trees is echoing not just Milton, but also the murmuring grove of When First I Journeyed Hither. And this gives a highly personal dimension to the fraternal four at Borrowdale. Perhaps explains why, when Wordsworth revisited them imaginatively, bereft of his favourite brother, they should seem worthier of note than the solitary tree at Lawton. In the letter to Sir George Beaumont about landscape gardening that I mentioned, which was written a few months after John's death, Wordsworth explicitly drew parallels between poetry and planting, and remarked, "Strip my neighbourhood of human beings, and I should think it one of the greatest privations I could undergo." And he added that anything he might have to say about natural beauty will begin and end in the human heart. Solitude and solitary figures were a perennial preoccupation for Wordsworth and central to the Excursion, which also appeared in 1814. But solitude had been associated with yew-trees since his school days, as we see from the poem in Lyrical Ballads, Lines Left on a Seat by a Yew-Tree, with its memory of the disappointed idealist who used to sit alone under the tree. Now, the melancholy tendencies of that solitary figure are firmly checked in the yew-tree lines as the dangerous results of pride. So the pride of Lorcan Vale is not necessarily an unalloyed expression of approval. And there may actually be a further association for Umfreville here, because it was the name of a local family, but it was also the name of the solitary recluse in Henry Mackenzie's influential journal, The Mirror, so a byword for reclusiveness in this period. The image of one standing single in the midst of its own darkness haunts Wordsworth's poetry and adds a deep but indefinite quality to the opening lines of Yew-Trees. Is this magnificent ancient tree admirable? Or is there something horrifying about its eternal gloom and isolation? Between the versions, written in 1811 and 1814, Wordsworth suffered further losses with the deaths of his two children, Catherine and Thomas. When he was revising Yew-Trees, he was only too aware of the darker facets of isolation, the devastating experience of outliving those you love. The longevity of the yew, a living thing produced too slowly ever to decay, is not necessarily his most enviable feature. In another poem of this painful period, Wordsworth recalled little Catherine and her imaginative self-sufficiency. Solitude to her is blithe society, who fills the air with gladness and involuntary songs. The contrast with the gloom of the Lorton yew could hardly be more marked. In Surprised by Joy, Wordsworth acknowledged that neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore. It's the voice of the survivor, faced with the prospect of empty years stretching ahead without his child. He had been profoundly affected by John's death, but now he was grappling with ways of expressing painful losses, even more painful losses perhaps. No wonder then that the ghostly shapes congregating amidst the sable boughs and Borrowdale are those of fear and trembling hope, silence and foresight, death the skeleton and time the shadow. The personification of these abstracts as ghostly shapes seems somewhat remote from Regency England, but it's a chastening reminder of human experience. The fear associated with yew-trees is not a pagan ritual. The Druids of the earlier draft are banished from the published poem, but of the human condition. Under the cover of the oldest living things in Europe, whose lifespan makes ours seem brief as an insect's, the deepest anxieties take shape. And yet, the poem itself, with its strong, sinuous, interconnected lines, has a resilient quality, braced to withstand even potentially overwhelming fears. Wordsworth knew the difficulties surrounding painful subjects. In 1817, news that John Scott was going to write about the recent death of his child prompted deep concern. "I'm sorry he's about to publish on so melancholy an occasion," he wrote. "His verse, I fear, will have too large an infusion of pain in them to be either generally pleasing or serviceable, whatever degree of genius they may exhibit." And he went on to recall Falwell's verses on the death of his daughter, saying, "Though they have great merit, one cannot read them, but with much more pain than pleasure." And this is a salutary letter. It reminds us of Wordsworth's deep understanding of poetry and its prime purpose, to give pleasure. He explains it in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. The poet writes under one restriction only, namely, that of giving immediate pleasure to a human being. So in revealing some of the painful undercurrents from which yew-trees grew, we should, I think, be careful not to render the poem unbearable and therefore unreadable and unserviceable. Wordsworth's poem is a memorial verse, but it's a memorial to the enduring power of deep feeling as much as to those he's lost. Through language, he's gathering together a host of memories and emotions, and the word fraternal embraces his own brothers, his children, his earlier tribute to John, to brotherhood of trees in other poems, and the bond of brotherhood with nature. Words have the power to reveal hidden links, to infuse new life into poetry, and to preserve what might otherwise be slipping away. But ultimately, they give pleasure through their own rightness of sound and sense. Like Yew-Trees, Wordsworth's poem is full of hidden secrets, which are slow to be revealed, often hard to interpret, but nevertheless testament to the latency of all in each. And I can understand why Coleridge thought Yew-Trees demonstrated its imaginative power. Wordsworth stands nearest of all modern writers to Shakespeare and Milton, and yet in a kind perfectly unborrowed and his own. Something about Wordsworth's poetry is lasting. It outlives the whims of fashion and reaches back to earlier sources, rather like a yew-tree. In Wordsworth's remarkable work, Coleridge recognised the radical recovery of the very sources of poetic power, a regeneration of modern poetry free from imitativeness or belatedness. For Coleridge and Wordsworth, poetry should be a power like one of nature's, and new growth could be nourished through allusions that reach back into the taproots of English tradition, as long as it was firmly planted in truth, tried and tested through personal experience. Yew-Trees is one of the great poems of Wordsworth's maturity, and if it had its origins in the 1804 tour, it may also have been inspired by the later stanzas of the Intimations Ode, which Wordsworth completed that year. In those grand stanzas, he answered the haunting question spoken by the single tree: whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory in the dream? He understood only too well that the visionary power of childhood couldn't last into adulthood. Nothing can bring back the hour of splendour in the grass, the glory in the flower. But this didn't lead to despair or creative paralysis. As the ode asserts resoundingly, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy, which having been, must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. And where better to find an image of resilient survival, of everlasting life, of primal sympathy, extending through the years, than in these ancient trees. Now, I'm not arguing that the tree of many one is referring specifically to the Lawton yew. It could be any of the special trees in Wordsworth's imaginative landscape. A single tree is never really single, it's always one of many. Johnny's holly bough is linked to the tall holly at the excursion, and the holly that Wordsworth planted at Langrig in memory of Burns's holly crown. Each individual tree offers connection with others, and with the people who've imbued them with special associations. Wordsworth recognised the strength in what remains behind, the way in which feeling comes in aid of feeling, and so he planted trees in memory of Burns, of John, of his children, of Dora. One tree can stand for all of Wordsworth's single trees, simultaneously figures of loss and connection. Through their internal echoes, murmurings of the past, affinities are preserved, like the brotherhood of elms, the brotherhood of venerable trees felled by Douglas, the fraternal four of Borrowdale. The connections may not be immediately visible, but they provide an underlying strength that withstands the shocks of time and adversity. And as Wordsworth achieved a kind of poetry that possessed the latency of all in each, he was planting for posterity, which is why 200 years later, we're still benefiting from Wordsworth's trees. Thank you.